In 1916, General John "Blackjack" Pershing tasked the Apache Scouts from the 10th and 11th Cavalry with the mission of tracking down Pancho Villa. The prospect of a new challenge, along with the hunt for the elusive bandit and his men, awakened the warrior spirit in the Scouts. The turbulent days of the Apache campaigns of the 1880s were long gone. By 1916, life had quieted down significantly compared to the intense efforts of earlier decades, when countless scouts and soldiers had searched the American Southwest and Mexico for renegade Apaches who refused to stay on reservations. The Apache Scouts of this time were a tight-knit group, tough and skilled in tracking, fighting, and riding like their ancestors. However, they were also mired in a period of monotonous duty that lacked the excitement they were accustomed to. But everything changed on March 9, 1916, when Pancho Villa and his revolutionary forces launched a daring attack on the border town of Columbus, New Mexico. The small town, located near the border, was battered by dust storms and dry conditions. The Mexican Revolution had already brought years of betrayal and violence, affecting both nations. The assault on American soil sent shockwaves through the United States, and the government could not tolerate such an act. Villa had badly miscalculated by attacking the U.S. His intent was to rekindle the revolutionary spirit of Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty. But this move ultimately backfired. Furious at the U.S. for supplying weapons to his rival, Venustiano Carranza, Villa's rage was further fueled by his hatred of Carranza, whom he saw as a coward and a man who had gained power without confronting the tyranny of General Huerta. Villa's sense of betrayal led him to take violent action, attacking U.S. citizens, killing and injuring many, and leaving the battlefield littered with casualties. In response, the U.S. government, which was typically slow to act, responded swiftly. Soon after the attack, thousands of troops were mobilized to apprehend Villa and punish his forces. The mission, known as the Punitive Expedition or the Mexican Expedition, was led by Brigadier General John "Blackjack" Pershing. Pershing, with his deep experience from the Indian Wars in the Southwest, was a strict disciplinarian and a master of organization. He requested Apache Scouts for the mission, knowing their exceptional tracking skills and expertise. His goal was to complete the operation efficiently, though he often found himself frustrated by interference from President Woodrow Wilson, who frequently second-guessed his military commanders. For the Apache Scouts, the months spent tracking Villa and serving under General Pershing would become one of their final, yet most thrilling chapters. An unforgettable experience that would eclipse the quiet years before as they chased Villa across the Mexican border. Many of the older Apache Scouts had either served in or had family members involved in the Geronimo campaigns. By 1916, only 24 Scouts remained, but during the Punitive Expedition, General Pershing expanded their ranks to 35. These Scouts would once again serve on a significant mission in Mexico. Despite having lived in relative peace along the border for about 30 years, the Apache Scouts felt uneasy about entering the territory of their traditional adversaries, the Mexicans. To them, there was no distinction between friendly Mexicans and those aligned with Carranza or Villa. Their perspective was simple: shoot 'em all. Caution became a significant factor in their operations, more so than they had anticipated. Ace Daklugi, the nephew of Geronimo, shared with historian Yves Ball his thoughts on the Apache Scouts' approach to their work, explaining that an Apache Scout never wanted to be caught off guard. For them, avoiding surprise was synonymous with survival. Successful commanders such as Captains John G. Bourke, Emmett Crawford, and Lieutenants Britton Davis, Charles B. Gatewood, James Shannon, and H. B. Warfield understood that the more they respected Apache Scouts' cultural traditions and beliefs, the more effective and responsive the Scouts would be in their military duties. In 1883, U.S. Army Captain John G. Bourke described the Apache Scouts pursuing the Chiricahua Apaches as individuals deeply in tune with the natural environment. These Scouts knew the land intimately, understanding every trail, every mark that told the story of the passage of people or animals. Their skills, learned from childhood, made them invaluable to the military. More than 3 decades later, Captain James Shannon, who was in charge of the Scouts, wrote, "To achieve results, they must be allowed to operate in their own way. This extreme caution is one of the traits that make them perfect Scouts. It would be nearly impossible to surprise a unit with Apache Scouts at the front." Though Lieutenant Shannon was from the East, he had come to greatly appreciate his Apache Scouts. He admired their ability to maintain an organized camp, their care for their horses, and especially their commitment to their traditional religious practices. He observed that they used the sweat lodge almost daily, and each scout carried sacred objects, like Hottentot, a sacred pollen, in their uniforms for prayers. These were the same men now tracking down Villa and his gang of cutthroats, as the American press had begun to label them. Although there were numerous smaller clashes and incidents, 2 significant engagements took place in May and June of 1916, where the Apache Scouts took the lead and relished the opportunity to engage in battle while fulfilling their scouting duties. Historian Friedrich Katz described the action at Rancho Ojos Azules as the greatest victory achieved by the Punitive Expedition. It also significantly boosted the morale of the troops. The Apache Scouts particularly enjoyed this engagement, as it allowed them to showcase their abilities in both combat and tracking. On May 5th, after completing a grueling 35-mile march, a group of Apache Scouts, accompanied by members of the 11th Cavalry, arrived at El Rancho Ojos Azules, Blue Springs. The area was known to be frequented by Villistas, making it an ideal opportunity to confront the enemy forces that had attacked the United States and possibly capture Villa himself. Julio Acosta, leading over 150 experienced soldiers loyal to Villa, was active in the region. Major Robert L. Howes quickly assembled 6 troops of the 11th Cavalry, a machine gun unit, a pack train with 4 days' worth of supplies, and the Apache Scouts, who acted as the vanguard for the main column. The small American force, comprising only a handful of officers and about 140 enlisted men, prepared to face the Villistas. Remarkably, no Americans were injured in the battle, while over 50 Villistas were reported killed, with an equal number captured. Major Howze, determined to secure a victory, pushed on with a forced night march to catch the enemy by surprise the following morning. Just a month earlier, Howze had been forced to abandon a pursuit of Villa due to a shortage of Apache Scouts, a situation exacerbated by accusations against the Scouts of committing atrocities, which led to the temporary suspension of their operations. This left Howze's forces at a disadvantage, unable to follow Villa's elusive tactics. This failure had been frustrating for everyone involved. However, this time, with the help of the Apache Scouts and 2 civilian guides, Howze felt confident that he was closing in on the Villistas. At dawn, the combined forces deployed, and the charge at Ojos Azules began. Some reports consider the battle at Ojos Azules as the final American cavalry charge in the traditional frontier style. It was executed with precision, as dozens of Villistas were caught in the crossfire, and the cavalry charge demonstrated the classic American approach to battle. Major Howze, commanding Troop A, acted as the mounted advance guard for the 11th Cavalry troops. The initial objective for the Scouts was to locate the Villistas and prevent their escape. However, once the Apaches discovered the enemy, they couldn't resist the urge to engage. They dismounted in their traditional fashion and fought fiercely until the rest of Howze's troops arrived. The Scouts fought alongside regular cavalry units, demonstrating their combat prowess. A charge was made with pistols drawn, and the American forces advanced in columns of 4 through the ranch, pushing the Villistas into retreat. Other troops moved to the sides of the ranch house, effectively blocking any possible escape routes with the support of the machine gun squad. The Apache Scouts eagerly led the charge against their longtime Mexican adversaries. An unusual role, as Scouts were typically tasked with locating the enemy and then retreating to avoid direct confrontation. First Lieutenant S.M. Williams, the adjutant and quartermaster for the expedition, later wrote an account for the U.S. Cavalry Journal describing the battle as lasting around 20 to 25 minutes of intense fighting, during which Apache scouts added to the chaos with their high-pitched war cries. The scouts also returned to camp with a variety of spoils, including saddles, bridles, captured horses and mules, ammunition, blankets, rifles, and pistols. Afterward, First Sergeant Chicken, Escanadista, was quoted as saying, "Hooly, damn fine fight." His men agreed. It was a remarkable achievement for both the scouts and the cavalry, considering the exhausting all-night march with heavily burdened horses and mules, leaving both men and animals fatigued upon arrival at Ojos Azules. Nevertheless, the courage and quick thinking of the scouts and soldiers led to their success in battle. Around a month later, on June 2nd, Lieutenant Shannon and his 20 Apache scouts engaged in a skirmish with some of Candelario Cervantes's men, who had recently stolen horses from the 5th Cavalry. Horse and mule theft became a common and often fiercely contested activity during this period. Even though the Villistas trail was more than a week old, the scouts managed to track them down to Las Veras Pass. Captain Shannon noted that his scouts quickly resumed tracking after a brief delay caused by a rocky section of the trail. The Apaches spread out, and soon one scout signaled the others, prompting them to resume their pursuit using the same method. Within an hour, the scouts had scattered the thieves as they fled into the mountains. Fortunately, no casualties were reported among Shannon's men, but once again there was no sign of Villa. The battles at Ojos Azules and Las Veras Pass did not go unnoticed in Mexico City, even though all casualties had been among the Villistas. Survivors of the Ojos Azules fight later admitted that facing the feared Apaches was a deeply unsettling experience. On June 28, 1916, Mexico's ambassador to the United States, Eliseo Arredondo, sent a stern note to U.S. Secretary of State Lansing, accusing Pershing's officers and the Apaches of committing atrocities. Pershing responded by dismissing these allegations as baseless, citing investigations that proved the charges to be untrue. Pershing's conclusions have been accepted by historians ever since. However, this controversy delayed progress in capturing Villa for several months. Interestingly, military reports from the time suggest that officers believed Villa could have been apprehended if the scouts had been used more effectively. After all, that was the main goal of the Punitive Expedition. Unfortunately for Carranza and his government, Mexico City's leaders, like Washington, had little understanding of the realities on the ground, something that worked in Villa's favor. Throughout the 7 months spent waiting to appease Carranza, the Apaches played a vital role in various military tasks, including tracking down American deserters, conducting reconnaissance, hunting, and repairing telegraph wires that had been sabotaged by the enemy. To keep his men occupied, Shannon occasionally led scouting trips, which helped him gain a new appreciation for their tracking skills. The Apaches not only tracked animals, but also used their deep knowledge of local wildlife to provide fresh meat for the camp, something that the white soldiers assigned to the same task struggled with in the same area. The scouts were also highly effective at locating deserters. After 3 soldiers vanished without a trace, the Apaches used their expert tracking skills to follow an invisible trail. One observant scout noticed that a fast-moving horse had tripped in a prairie dog hole, leaving a subtle mark where a cactus branch had been broken off. Using only hand signals, the scouts silently moved along the trail. Within 24 hours, they had located the deserters, and this technique was successfully employed many times thereafter. Mexico was a wild and barren land, particularly in the vast and rugged Sierra Madre mountain range. Villa was familiar with the terrain, but Pershing's troops were not. The campesinos, the local peasants, supported Villa and his dorados, while they had a deep resentment for the Americans, or gringos. Mexicans did not want the presence of U.S. forces on their soil. The only real advantage Pershing had were the Apache Scouts, who had been recruited in a similar manner as they had been during the Apache Wars of the previous century to track down renegades. It was a strategic and effective choice. The Punitive Expedition might have been the last military campaign to be carried out in the traditional frontier warfare style, blending the old and the new. Soldiers used truck convoys and traveled on mules or horseback as they transitioned into a more modern form of combat. But when following the elusive outlaws and villistas through the treacherous Sierra Madre, they were still stuck on primitive trails. Few roads existed. Most were dangerous paths winding through canyons and ravines. Pershing understood that success depended on utilizing every available resource in such an unforgiving environment. These were not just ordinary trails leading to town squares. They could be deadly traps. Villa, Fierro, and their comrades might be lying in wait in the hills nearby. And sometimes the Apache Scouts would uncover caves filled with supplies, weapons, and ammunition. Yet, despite all the resources and strategies at his disposal, Pershing was repeatedly outwitted by the cunning revolutionaries. While some bloody skirmishes did yield a few prisoners, they also enraged the Mexican residents of small villages, which reflected negatively on Pershing's operations, especially in the large city of Chihuahua, his headquarters. The city also had significant sentimental value for Villa, as it was his former stronghold. It was a humbling reality for Pershing that, after more than 11 months in the field and town, there was still no sign of the elusive Centaur of the North. While there were plenty of rumors and lightning-fast raids for supplies and horses, Villa himself remained a shadow. The campesinos, however, responded with defiance, composing corridos or folk songs to express their resilience. Maybe they have guns and cannons, maybe they are much stronger, we only have rocks and mountains, but we know how to endure longer. It must have been difficult for Pershing to admit that without the Apache Scouts, he would never have even come close to capturing José Doroteo Arango Arambula, better known as Pancho Villa, the infamous bandit general. After the Punitive Expedition concluded, in February 1917, the military reduced its forces by disbanding roughly half of the troops, leaving just 22 Apache Scouts on active duty at Fort Huachuca. However, their role in the conflict was far from finished. Tensions between the U.S. and Mexican forces persisted until 1920, and Apache renegades from the Sierra Madre region continued to disrupt ranching activities well into the 1930s. The Scouts also took on border patrol duties, ensuring that livestock did not stray into Mexican territory. Despite these continued efforts, the service with General Pershing and the Punitive Expedition marked what could be seen as the final chapter in the Apache Scouts' military involvement.